else. And I know for my wife and I, for Taryn and I, we have been working through a decision for the last few months, wrestling with this idea. And God has really just made some stuff really clear in the last little bit. And I wanted to share that because it gives context to this message today. So that's what I want to share. But we have actually been really struggling with whether or not to stay. Not because we don't like you guys. Don't get us wrong. We love you guys, actually. It's awesome. But we've just, in recent time, I don't know, I think it's the enemy tempting us. There's been a lot of job offers that were really lucrative, to be completely honest with you. There's been a lot of things come up where it's like, hey, if you did this, there'd be some nice shiny stuff. And I like shiny stuff, to be honest with you. And we have really worked through that in the last few months and really had to pray through that. And it wasn't until very recently, I'd say in the last probably 2 weeks, that we finally came to a spot where we said, you know what, God? Shiny stuff is cool for a bit, but what you do is eternal. And we want to be a part of that. And so we have come to the decision that we want to stick it out here at Church by the Canal because that's where God has us. And it's awesome. And you got to understand something about a Keith boy. I come from the Scottish. But we talk a lot like this all the time. But as a Keith, we have a long tradition of when we commit to something, we don't stop. That's my wife. She married me, and I haven't let her go yet. But we do. When we commit to something, it is for life. And in this case, when it comes to committing to the work that God has us doing here, we're committed to what God has called us to. So why is that important? Because it really does give a lot of context to what I want to talk to you guys about today. I want to talk to you guys about the concept of being the church. Okay, I'm not talking about going to church. I'm not talking about doing church. I want to talk about the concept of being the church. And to be honest, this is a little bit of an uncomfortable message sometimes. It's a little challenging. And it may take you outside what you're comfortable with. And I'd apologize, but God asked me to speak it. And I'll never apologize when God asks me to speak something. So if you got a problem, you just take it up with him. But, I was talking to a buddy of mine, a good friend of mine. His name's Damien. Actually, he'll be down there here this summer. And we were talking about this concept of the church and this trend we're seeing in the church. And I don't mean just us specifically. I mean the church across the board. And don't get me wrong, God is doing a good work in the church. But I'm starting to see this trend where we're transitioning from being the church to doing church. And there's a huge difference there. We've almost taken on this corporate CEO mentality in some cases, where we try to manage it like an organization in a business, where we've got our president and our vice president, our chair, and all that stuff, and we try to program things and schedule things in, and there's nothing wrong with those things. Don't get me wrong. I'm not like down with programming or anything like that, but I think our focus has shifted a little bit. And by a little, I mean a lot. I think we've transitioned out of this idea of being church, and we moved into this concept of doing church. And that's not good enough. It's not. I mean, you can do church. Anybody can do church. It's really simple. You show up on Sunday. In our case, you throw some chairs down. You set up a sound system. Pray it's going to work right. No breakers below. You do some songs. You say a few things, and you go home. It's easy to do church. But there's got to be more. Do you know what I mean? There's got to be more to it than that. And that's what I want to talk about today. If you have your Bibles, and I hope you do, because if you don't, you're going to have to trust that I can read, which is always scary. But if you do, open your Bibles to Acts 4. All right, we're going to look at 32 down to 35. Give you a second. Acts 4, 32 to 35, New Testament, right after the Gospels. Actually, right after John. But I just want you to listen to these words, because we're going to look a little bit at what being the church looked like in the context of Acts. And here it is. I'm going to read it out. It says, all the believers were one in heart and mind. No one claimed that any of his possessions was his own, but they shared everything they had. With great power, the apostles continued to testify to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus. And much grace was upon them all. There was no needy person among them. For from time to time, those who owned lands or houses sold them, brought the money for the sales, and put them in the apostles' feet. And it was distributed among all as they needed. Guys, the early church kind of had it together. In fact, that's probably when we see the most growth in the churches, in the early church, in the church of Acts, because they got it. They got the concepts. And I think if this remote works for me, hopefully it does. There we go. I think there's a couple things we can learn from the church of Acts. There we go. And one of them is that all the believers were one in heart and mind. There was this idea that Christ was important above everything else. That Christ was absolutely central, above programming, above scheduling, above Sunday worship. Christ was central. There was this idea that they were all together in this. They were united under this one banner of Christ. And I don't just mean verbally, I mean in the actions, the way they live their lives. We see them, in Acts, we see them literally giving possessions away, selling things so they can support each other. Because at the end of the day, that stuff was nothing compared to Christ. That stuff was secondary. It wasn't important because when Christ was the focal point, everything else kind of fell into place the way it should. You see, because when Christ is the focal point, you can trust him with all those other things. And I think that was a key component to why the early church grew the way it did. And even when it was persecuted, they scattered and they just kept growing. Because they were still all together in heart and mind. And I think that's really important. And it's something that is important in being the church. I'm going to keep clicking this until it works. There we go. Sweet, it did. All right. Also, there was this focus on testifying about the resurrection of Christ. There's a cool thing about the word testify. In that it's got a couple different definitions. It means to express personal conviction. All right, and that's probably what we saw a lot of what the apostles were doing. It wasn't just something they talked about. They were passionate about it. They were passionate about sharing Christ because he had done a transforming work in their life, and they needed to tell everybody about it. And it's this idea of making known something, and in this case it was Christ. They were passionate about making Christ known. It literally just poured out of them in everything they do. I mean, you look at examples even in Acts where guys like Peter and John are walking down the road. They're not even doing they're not in front of the synagogue or anything. They see a guy on the side of the road. And because they have this passion for Christ, they literally just start preaching to him, and he's healed and he walks, and just this incredible thing happens through that. Because it was a part of who they were. It was encoded in their DNA. It was just like talking about sports, or it was just like talking about your latest thing you pinned on Pinterest. It was literally just a part of who they were, and it came into every conversation. It became everything they were. It encompassed them. It enveloped them. I think that's one of the reasons the early church grew as much as it did. And the last thing, which I find interesting, is that there was much grace upon them. Much grace upon them. Just think about that for a minute. If you understand grace, I know we've talked about grace in the past, but there's this idea that when you put Christ central, when you put Christ the very center and put everything else aside, there's this grace that comes and envelops you. Imagine if we had a church that just poured out grace in every aspect of our lives. Imagine if we had a church where grace was the only answer to everything. Before we tried to program things and plan things, we acted in grace. That was the early church. That's what they did. It was incredible. And the results were incredible, actually, when you look at it here. All right, the results were this. They wanted Christ above all else, and as a result, there was no needy among them, no needy person among them. If you look at that word needy, I actually did a word study on this. And to be honest, I use Google because it's way faster than busting out like a Greek lexicon and a concordance, and I don't generally carry those around with me. I always have my phone, which has Google, so it's awesome. But when you do a study on this, you can actually see when they translated it over into English, there were two choices of words. There was needy, which we tend to think of that like physical need and stuff, but there's also this other word, deprived. And when you look at deprived, it's this idea of lacking. And I think that's a little more encompassing. This idea that, when they had Christ as their primary focus, they weren't deprived of anything, both physical and spiritual. As a result of putting Christ as the foundation, the cornerstone, the center of everything in their life, no matter who they were, no matter what path in life they walked, they weren't in need. Not just physically, but spiritually. And I think that's why Paul talked about it in Philippians. If you jump to Philippians, you don't have to. But in 4:12 and 13, he talks about this idea of contentment in all situations. He's like, I know what it's like to be poor, to be dirt poor, and I know what it's like to have a lot of stuff. He said, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter because I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. See, he understood what the early church was experiencing. It's this idea that when you put Christ in the forefront, when you put him at the center of church, there's no need. There's no want for anything because we have him. But you see, I'm concerned for the church today. And I don't just mean us. I mean, I think we can incorporate ourselves in there a bit. And I think there's a lesson there for us. But I'm concerned for the church today because I think sometimes we've substituted Christ for religion. And I'm not dogging on religion. I mean, religion has a place and there's tradition and those are good things in the right context. But I think we have gotten in the habit, because we're so used to doing things, that we've substituted Christ for this religious thing. And again, I'm not against religion. Please don't misunderstand me. But I think we've become so busy doing church and doing life that we stop being the church. Does that make sense? How many of you guys feel like, if I can make this work, feel like that some days? Do you ever look at your calendar and it's just chaos? My calendar most days looks like a sugared up 4-year-old grabbed a bunch of highlighters and just went to town. I mean, there's color coded everything on my calendar, and I know some of you guys can relate to that. It's just so busy. There's meetings to go to, appointments to go to. You got this activity and that activity. Busy is just a way of life, I think. Actually, I was doing some statistics reading. Not that I do that for fun. It was research. I wouldn't do that for fun. But anyways, I was doing some research on this. And actually, that this generation right now works more hours per week than any generation before. I think the average is somewhere between 51 to 70 hours a week we work. But however they figure out statistics, we are the least productive generation. How does it even work? I'm not good at math, but that doesn't add up. We work more hours than any other generation, yet we're the least productive generation. And I think in some ways that translates to the church. I mean, we are probably, this generation is probably the most established when it comes to the church. We probably have the most interactive services. I mean, with multimedia and Twitter and all that cool stuff. I was actually at a church and they have a multimedia team that circulates during the service and helps people that don't know how to use Twitter because they do a lot of stuff on Twitter. I mean, it's just crazy. We've become this super interactive thing. We've got some of the best programming going. And there's nothing wrong with programming. We really do. This generation has some awesome programming. I'm thinking even kids ministry. I've looked it over a little bit, and it's just awesome, the stuff we do. But I think despite all that, despite all those cool things we have, sometimes we replace Christ with our scheduling and our busyness, and we think that's church because it's just become a habit. We get in this habit of just being this thing or doing this thing as opposed to being the church. And I do think there's a solution. I at least hope there is, or this would be a really bad sermon. But I do think there is a solution to this. I really do. But I don't think it's something we can start on a corporate level as a group. I think that in order to be the church, it has to start with each one of us as individuals. You see, it's a misconception that we program our way out of this stuff. You can't. Being the church is not about programming. It's about starting with the individuals. And I think it comes down to this concept of rest, which seems really odd, but I promise it'll make sense later. We are so busy all the time. I think we've forgotten how to rest, or even what rest means. I say, well, you got to rest. Well, I sleep. Well, no, that's not rest. That's actually not rest. That's sleep. There's a big difference there. Let me get that to work. There we go. Maybe. So this worked really well when we practiced. But anyways, so there's this idea of rest, and this is what rest is all about. In fact, Jesus actually talked about it in Matthew. He said, listen, if you're tired out, if you're worn out, if you're burned out, and I am paraphrasing just for the record, if you're tired and you're worn out and you're burdened, come to me and I will give you rest. You see, we see in Scripture, in the life of Christ, even times where he literally ran away from people to get rest. He would literally like ditch everybody, and they'd be looking for him and searching all over the place. He'd be hiding just so he could rest and get away. And I think it's a very biblical thing. We have a tendency that we have to sacrifice all the time for Christ. Christ isn't looking for sacrifice. He's looking for obedience. There's a big difference there, and we get those confused. But Christ has modeled it. He spoke on it. And I really do think it's this biblical mandate that we need to rest. In fact, I looked it up, and you can see it there. It says to cause a permanent, or to permit one to cease from any movement or labor in order to recover and collect his strength. All right? I got another definition if I can get this to work. It says to give rest, refresh. To give oneself rest, take rest. And the last one, which I'm a big fan of, to keep quiet, of calm and patient. Oh, I think there's supposed to be more there, but anyways. But it's this idea of being quiet and waiting in anticipation is what that should say. And again, because I was using Google, I looked up the word rest. And there's actually a Greek translation that you can sort of say in English. And this is it. It's na-pau. Anapau. I just spoke Greek. Isn't that cool? But no, there's this concept, but when you look at it in the Greek, it's less about sleeping and stuff like that, but it's actually about making a conscious choice to set aside time to focus. It's a conscious choice to set aside time. It's not about going to take a nap. It's not about, turning off everything, closing the blinds, and not talking to anybody. It's literally about making an active choice to stop. It seems contradictory to the term, but it's actually what rest is. It's making a conscious decision to stop what you're doing and slow down. Rest is a process of being refreshed or restored. It's not this getaway thing. It's literally a process, an active process that God wants to do. Restoration is a process that's going from being battered and worn out to refreshed and renewed. How many of you guys like old cars? Anybody here like old cars? You can raise your hand on this. I'm curious. Yeah, I love old cars. I'm not going to lie. I'm a big fan of old cars. Grew up around them. My grandfather was a backyard mechanic. My dad's a backyard mechanic. I'm a sort of backyard mechanic. I can kind of break things real easy. But I grew up around old cars. And I remember to this date, it's like imprinted in my mind, the first time I saw a restored car. And it was cool because my dad had a buddy who did that for a living. He just restored cars and fixed them. And before I was allowed to see this restored car, they actually sat me down and showed me the pictures of the process they went through. And I remember, to this day, I remember what the car is. It's a 1957 Chevy Bel Air two-door coupe. It was black, had the white stripe on the side, red leather interior. It was gorgeous. But when I was looking at the pictures, I saw this old rusted frame. And I saw it as they went through this process of restoring the car. And in one shot, you saw like just this rusted frame. You saw the next one, they were starting to work down and burn off the rust and clean it up. They went through like the whole sand cleaning. I don't know if you know what that means, but basically they blow sand all over the car, and it just peels all the grossness off. It's incredible. And then they went through the process of installing the engine and cleaning it up and painting all the parts. And so then finally I got to walk in and see this car in the garage. And I tell you, looking at the pictures and then looking at the result, just this incredible transformation that took place. And they even let me sit in it. I was like 6. It was awesome. Couldn't see over the steering wheel. Probably still couldn't today. Those things are huge. But it was just this cool experience of seeing something that was worn out, that was battered, that was beaten, transformed and restored into something renewed and refreshed. See, that's what rest is. That's what rest is. That's what Christ was talking about in this. He's inviting us, when he's talking to Matthew, he's inviting us on this journey of restoration. It's not just about like, here, God, here's all my junk. You take care of that. I'm going to do something else. No, it's actually a journey that Christ takes us on of restoring us, of rest. I mean, and David talked about it in Psalms, and he's like, restore my soul. If you do a study on that word restore, it's this continual process that God is doing. And that's what rest actually is. He's inviting us on this journey to be refreshed. And we've got to accept it. That's kind of what it comes down to. Which brings the next question to mind. How is it going to work? There we go. How do we become restored? And I think because Jesus is really smart, he answered that question too in the same passage. And I'm actually going to read this one out of the Message. because I like how it's phrased. The Message is interesting. It's a really good side study tool. I wouldn't use it as necessarily my source code, but it's a great side tool because it's very poetic in the way it's written. It's very, just a very plain but poetic language. And so I wanted to listen to the way that the writers phrase this in English. It says, abruptly, and I'm reading in 25, I'm going right down to the 30. It says, abruptly Jesus broke into prayer. He said, thank you, Father, Lord of heaven and earth. You've concealed your ways from sophisticates and know-it-alls, but spelled them out clearly to ordinary people. Yes, Father, that's the way you like to work. Jesus resumed talking to the people, but now tenderly. The Father has given me all these things to do and say. This is a unique father-son operation, coming out of the Father and Son intimacies and knowledge. No one knows the Son the way the Father does, nor the Father the way the Son does. But I'm not keeping it to myself. I'm ready to go over it line by line with anyone willing to listen. Are you tired? Worn out? Burned out on religion? Come to me. Get away with me, and you'll recover your life. I'll show you how to take real rest. Walk with me and work with me. Watch how I do it. Learn the unforced rhythms of grace. I love that phrase, the unforced rhythms of grace. I won't lay anything heavy or ill-fitting on you. Keep company with me, and you'll learn to live freely and lightly. You see, Jesus, when he opened up that invitation, he was explaining, like all that stuff before he actually gets to the part where he says, come to me if you're tired out. He's explaining what that actually looks like. And it's this cool relationship, this connection. There's this direct connection between coming to him for rest and getting to know God. See, because God the Father and God the Son have this very unique relationship to the point that they know each other like no one else knows them, probably because they're related. But the cool part is that through the Son, we get to know the Father. And so when we choose to take up that rest or begin that journey of restoration, it's a process of getting to know God better. It's a process of getting to know the Father through the Son. But it's an active thing. It is awesome when we accept Christ into our life, but that's literally like step one in the process of getting to know God. Getting to know God is a lifetime journey, but I think a lot of times what happens is we kind of, accept Jesus in our heart, which is awesome. It's the best moment ever. We get baptized, it's really good, and then we just kind of flip it to neutral and coast through life. A lot of times we just kind of cruise along and say, yep, I know Jesus, I'm going to heaven, it's awesome. Praise Jesus on Sunday, it's good. And that's fine. That's a life. But it's not the life Christ has for us. It's not what Christ wants for us. He wants this restoration process. He wants us to become new. He wants us to stop trusting in models for ministry. He wants us to stop trusting in the scheduling of the church. He wants us to stop trusting in the programming and even of ourselves and instead trust Christ. And then through that, he can do some incredible stuff. I don't think this is rocket science by any stretch, but I think we have a tendency to substitute that relationship for the religion. We accept Christ, we jump in church, well, this is how church is done, this is what we do, and we go through our days, and we just get in that rhythm, that unnatural rhythm of doing church, which actually becomes very draining and very tiring, because you're just doing church. Which is why I like that phrase, the unforced rhythm of grace. It means it's a natural thing that should be happening in our lives, where grace is literally coming to our lives more and more every day as we draw closer to Christ in restoration and rest. More and more we get that grace in our life, and more that grace pours out of us, because it's like when you fill up a glass of water. If you keep filling the glass, what happens? It's not a trick question, I promise. What happens? Someone. It overflows. That's right. Yeah, it just pours out everywhere. Aiden is awesome at doing that. He's incredibly good at doing that. It's amazing. No matter how big the glass is, he will always find a way to overflow it if he tries. But that's how our life should be. We should be filling up so much with grace. We should be drawing so close to God that it literally just keeps pouring out of us. That it literally becomes our nature of having this grace. But again, I think we've substituted we substitute relationship for religion. We have to prioritize relationships over religion. If we want to be the church the relationship with Christ, and by extension with others, has to be more important than anything else we do in the church. It has to be the centerfold of what we do. We need to prioritize relationship over religion. In fact, I think, and again, I don't think that tradition or religion is bad. Please don't misunderstand me. And I keep saying that because I don't want you to misunderstand me. But I think it has a place. And I heard a great quote that really kind of put it in perspective for me. Apparently I missed it. Sorry. There we go. Okay. Tradition makes a great passenger, but it's a terrible driver. A good friend of mine, actually, he runs a church in Halifax called Deepwater. He's just amazing at these one-liner quotes that should be etched in stone somewhere because they're just genius. And he quoted this the other day on Twitter, actually. But it's very true. It kind of puts things in perspective. We've got to put relationship first. It's not that tradition is bad, but it needs to take a back seat to the relationship with Christ and by extension, other people. How does that tie back into the church? I want to show you this video clip, and then hopefully it'll help.
Whoa. What's going on, Mr. Voss?
Biology, Derek.
Fair enough.
Can someone tell me what happens when a cell stagnates?
Okay, no one's listening to me.
I will try again. Anyone know what happens to a stagnant cell?
What's he doing on the table?
I don't know. Something about cells.
Malia,
It's not good.
did you hear that? It ain't good. People, a cell that is not in motion is not a productive member of the system. It ends up assuming all the other cells are going to pick up the slack somewhere, but they don't. In fact, they imitate the stray cell until basically the whole organism begins to die. Yeah, but you know what? Biology is an amazing thing. And here's the good news. All that decays can be restored. It's just hitting anybody.
Like how a cut heals.
Like how a cut heals. Brian, my man.
Look, you got one.
And once that cell is back on track, it creates energy amongst the other cells. That's what happens. It starts getting a little movement going. It gets a little rumble. Can I get a little rumble from everybody? Everybody just rumble in your seats right now for me. Just rumble a little bit. Okay, no rumble. That's fine. I'll be the lone rumbler up here. That's what I am. I'm a lone rumbler. But then the cell starts banging into the other cells. And the cells push back and go, hey, what are you doing to me? They hit into another one. Hey, don't do that. Hey, that's my friend. You don't even know him. You don't know me either. I know you. We work together. Because then they hit a rhythm. All hit a rhythm, and this is the beginning of the restorative process. So now, even if the entire system is close to dead, what happens? Martinez, come on, give me something. Oh no, not today.
Oh no, not in my house. No. Look out, here we come. Don't look up my pant leg, Derek. You're better than that. It's right over you.
Come on, man. What do you say? If all the cells work together, what will happen?
The entire system is healed.
Exactly. That is a sick dragon.
You see, guys, restoring the church to a point that we are the church starts with the individual. But you see, grace is contagious. That's the cool thing about grace, is that if you are someone that is full of grace, it spills over into the lives of others. And as more people catch on to that grace, and as more people make Christ the center of their lives, as more people go through that process of transitioning away from doing church to being church, that's when the church comes together and starts being the church. It has to start at an individual level. But when you have a group of individuals who are focused on Christ and focused on being restored in Him, that's when things get crazy. And that's when we start being the church. as opposed to doing church. There we go. It's only when individuals start accepting Christ's invitation to learn the unfocused rhythms of grace that the church can truly be the church. It's when individuals, each one of us, starts to accept that way of life that we're really being the church. The reality is the Church by the Canal, we can do church. We're pretty good at it. In fact, we can come in at 8:30 and have this place looking shiny by the time you all show up at 10:30. And we can be ready to roll. But we need to be more. We really do. We need to be more than just doing church. We need to be the church. And what does that look like? I don't know exactly what that looks like, but I have some ideas. I think it looks like us having relationships trumping timetables. Having relationships be more important than timetables. I think it's investing in people and not numbers. We have this mentality, we got to fill our church, fill our church, fill our church. If you're concerned with the numbers over the people, you're doing it wrong. We need to invest in the people, not the numbers. We need to share meals, not memberships. We need to be more concerned with investing in the lives of others. There's something sacred about a meal. I think that's why it was such a big deal in the New and Old Testament. That's why Christ sat down with his disciples and broke bread, and they shared that wine. It does represent the body and the blood of Christ, but it's more than that. It was, when you were invited, especially in Jewish culture, when you're invited into someone's house, that was like you saying, you are a close friend. You're allowed into my inner sanctum. You're allowed into my home, and I'm going to have this meal with you. See, and that's the type of mentality we have to have for people, more so than come to our church so we can make you a member. You know what I mean? We need to share meals, not memberships. We need to boldly represent Christ, not a religion. We need to be more concerned with sharing Christ than sharing our spin on religion. Because Christ is our religion, so he's kind of more important. But at the end of the day, we need to be more concerned with being Christ's representatives Monday through Saturday than we are about counting heads on Sunday morning. Guys, church isn't one day a week. It's not even an hour and a half a week. It is a lifestyle. Being the church is a lifestyle. And if we want to see, growth, if we want to see God do an awesome work here, it has to start with us. It starts with the individuals being restored and finding rest in God and drawing close to him and allowing that grace just to pour through them and through that overflow into the lives of the people around them. This is what I think church should be. I don't think we should do church. The reality is anybody can do church. We've already proven that. Anybody. St. Catherine's is a great example of people doing church. You know how many churches there are in St. Catherine's? It's hard to drive down a street without seeing a church. You can do church, and I'm not trying to dog on the work of those churches. I know a lot of them are doing some incredible work. It's not what I mean. What I mean is that anybody can do church, but we need to be the church. We have to be a people that aren't afraid to literally storm the gates of hell if it means saving the masses. Sound a little dramatic? That's because it is. That's the reality. That's the life we live. We need to carry the weight of the lost on our hearts to the point of action. We need to be burdened for the people around us. And if you're not, it's time. The reality is we don't always look our best on Sunday, but the reason for that should be because we've shone our brightest Monday through Saturday. And when we come to church, it's a time to be restored and encouraged. I think that's what we need to look like. It's not, it's not programmed. You can't schedule it. And you can't even fake it. If you want to be the church, it has to be real. It has to be a conscious decision of the individual to trade in religion for the relationship that Christ is offering. It has to be a conscious decision to take up rest in Christ. And then through that, be restored. Guys, I've committed to this church. And I want to see it restored. I want it to be a church that is being the church, not doing church. And I know that Al is right on board with me because every time we talk about this, he gets really giddy and excited. And if you haven't seen Al giddy and excited, it's really fun. But in order to do that, we need to put aside the religion and take that in the right context. And we need to put the relationship with Christ as the focal point. That has to be where it starts. If we can't do that, you might as well give up now. Because we can go on doing church, but it's not going to do anything. It's not until we start being the church that we're going to see change in this area and in St. Catharines and out from there. Because if we can choose that lifestyle, that's when we're going to really learn to live freely and to live lightly without the burdens of life. That's what Christ was talking about, you know. If you're burdened, if you're worn out, if you're tired, come to me. Learn to be restored in grace. I'm not going to throw anything on you that's heavy. But instead, I'm going to give you a life that just oozes grace. And that, my friends, is how we can be the church.